Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast featuring real conversations with conscious objectors to the status quo. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
On today's episode, we have a sex therapist, licensed clinical social worker, and sex worker, Soleil. Join us for a conversation about how structural oppression is embedded in psychotherapy. Together, we talk about burnout and therapy under capitalism, building a new world of connected healing, and how basic sex education can get you fired. Pet cat, are you gonna come sit? Come sit while I record. Yeah. Oh, this episode was hard, I think that after recording with Soleil, I just felt so down. I mean, I felt seen in a lot of different ways, but I also just felt so down and frustrated about how therapy is reenacting other sorts of oppression. I think when we go into the field of psychology or any other healing profession, we want to help and we want to serve other people and we want to do good in the world. And it can be hard to think about the ways in which our healing practices are actually reenacting further oppression. And I think that's the reality we have to sit with in a lot of different things, right? Is that we are all privileged in some way, shape, or form and enacting harm on other people, whether we're aware of that or not. And that process of becoming aware of it can be really difficult and it can feel really painful as you start to see the ways in which something like therapy, right? It's this good practice, right? You're helping people, is actually really rooted in colonial forms of oppression. So we're going to have the conversation about it. We're going to talk about it. And I think that's a really important piece because the awareness is step one. And if this is a conversation that we avoid, then we don't understand even that and hence further harm. So let's get into a little bit of the nitty gritty. And if you are a therapist yourself, I'm sure you will understand. I hope you feel seen in this episode. I see you in the burnout and the pain of this job and what that looks like. And if you're not a therapist, send this episode to your therapist friend or get some insider scoop on what it's like on the other side. Before I went down this path, I really didn't know what therapists, day to day, how did they get paid? What was it like? All of those sorts of pieces. So I think it's important to lift the veil on that as well and remind the world that therapists, again, and I've said this multiple times on the podcast, are humans who come with their own bias. And that's really important, okay? We are not the sources of be-all and all truth. And that is frequently what happens in the society where once you get that sort of label, people look to you in this way of having knowledge. And it is true, we go through education, we go through so much training, but that education and training is based in very colonial, patriarchal forms of knowledge. So, first off, can we just talk about even Maslow's hierarchy of needs? If you're in the field of psychology, you're going to know what I'm talking about. He has this sort of pyramid. And at the top, the highest form of development that you could do, y'all, is individual self-expression. Okay, we got to talk about that. What is more of a Western idea than that the highest thing we can do in our lifetime is achieve individuality rather than community connection and service? What? That is just a small drop of the ways that the field of psychology is often reenacting these harmful notions of what it means to be self-actualized. And when I'm in my family systems class and my professor begins to talk about what a real relationship is, which is one that you're married and living together in a home, yeah, I've got problems with that. Who says that a real relationship is the one that you're married to, the one that you live? Talk about the relationship escalator. At this point, I assume if you're listening to this podcast, you know what I'm talking about. But the reality is the field of psychology and what is taught in these classes does not. So maybe your therapist does not, right? These are the ways in which we can reenact harm, okay, through this system. And we have to be committed to undoing the oppression. And that looks like both acknowledging the ways in which therapy is a beautiful healing practice, one that can allow for so much transformation and so much good in the world. And also, it is one that can do harm and reenact oppression, and we can hold both. One important way that we can have a critical paradigm shift is looking at therapy through companionship. At the end of the day, I am companioning with my clients and joining them in this journey of unpacking their story and navigating survival under these systems of oppression and finding pleasure under these systems, right? And I'm going to join them in that with my services, my humanness, my relationality, and all of that then is being humble and honest about the ways that we're not experts in life and what it means to be quote unquote normal, all of that sort of stuff. We really get into this in today's episode. And I think an important piece to remember is that we have to dream of a new future. We have to keep thinking and dreaming of spaces of how we can have maybe a more socialist access to therapy and these other sorts of resources, ways that don't further perpetuate colonial harm and replicate capitalist frameworks. I know we have to survive while in that, and so there is ways that we can do that, but also let's keep dreaming of what this other world is going to look like. Maybe a world that will transpire beyond our lifetimes for future generations, but we are a part of changing that movement. And I do believe, truly believe, that another world is possible and that collectively we can find our way towards that world. So with that, I invite you to give a hug to your therapist friends and any other healers that you know, because at the end of the day, we are sitting at a space of trauma. There is a resource I linked below called Decolonizing Healthcare, and it has this beautiful chart that talks about all of the various pieces of supremacy and colonization and all these other pieces under capitalism that lead to large amounts of trauma, and your therapist and all of the healers get placed into that one slot there to try and heal all of these large systems of oppression, which is impossible. We can give skills, we can sit with, but at the end of the day, these systems of oppression are going to keep going, and it is problematic if we come to a queer client who is anxious about stepping out into the world and give them anxiety and say something is wrong with you, and don't take that larger step to say something is wrong with a society that makes it unsafe for you to be your authentic self. This is something that really pissed me off. There was a New York Times article that talked about kids being anxious to go to school, and it was like the kids these days are having higher anxiety and are no-showing to classes, yada, yada, yada. Y'all, there wasn't a single mention of school shootings. Kids are anxious to go to school. It's their fault. They have anxiety. What's wrong with them? Okay, when the news every other day is hitting on another mass school shooting, how are we not taking that into context in articles like that and places like the therapy room and diagnostics? If we are not addressing these factors, we are reenacting harm by placing the diagnosis, the blame onto the individual without looking at these larger systems of oppression that are all affecting us, and even the ones in which you, anyone with privilege, and we all have privilege in different ways, are reenacting on one another. So it's important to slow down and have conversations like these that dream of ways that we can build that new future, because, again, I really do believe that collectively we can come to a new space with all of this. And dear listener, I will be with you in this space every Wednesday, tuning in to have these difficult conversations, to dream of a new world of how we could be in connection with one another, and a world where more space is allowed for us to be our authentic self, a world where more pleasure is possible, and where basic sex education conversations will not get you fired. I hope that you enjoy today's episode and tune in.
Yes,
So how would you introduce yourself to the guest who has never heard you and what you're about?
I tend to always need it I like having a daddy or somebody or someone to structure.
I'll be your daddy today.
Structure me, Nicole.
Yes.
Well, thank you for having me here. I'm glad to be in this conversation. I'm currently going by Soleil. That is the name I feel aligned with. Formerly Angie. I've been a clinical social worker for 20 years, sex therapist for 10, been doing sex work for 15, been doing sex education, facilitation, community engagement, community building, activism in sex-related spaces for about 10 years as well. And overall, a sex weirdo in the sense that I grew up fundamentalist Christian and didn't have any access to my pleasure, and then spent most of the last 15 years trying to learn how to be a sexual being, how to be in my body, how to heal trauma, how to connect to my own expression and my own identity, which a lot of it happened through queer spaces, kink spaces, non-monogamy, sex work, all moving towards what it means to be a liberated being in a body that we deserve to have total autonomy over. We deserve to have rights to access every part of our bodies in any way we might see fit, whether that's for commerce or for pleasure or for play or for creativity or expression, that it is our tool that we've been given to function in without choice and yet have to navigate how to do it. And I tend to be, folks who meet me now say that I'm maybe one of the most real and unfiltered humans they meet, because I don't have much I give very, very little fucks. My nihilism right now takes the form of nihilistic optimism, where I'm being my fullest self and awaiting the end of the world. And it feels good to be more grounded and connected to being my best version of me and helping other people to fight to exist fully, especially as sexual beings in their current space. So I think interestingly, we talked a little bit prior to this, I don't know where you're going to edit the conversation, but what it would mean to talk a little bit about my clinical journey and how I'm still even roughly tangentially connected to clinical spaces, even though I'm the most radical therapist people could ever work with.
I love that.
And yeah, kind of how I got here and what I'm doing now. Does that feel like?
Yeah, let's do it.
I actually worked on this post, and I'm really good at making content and never publishing it. So, I'm sure at some point somebody will see this content. But I worked on this post about how I've been a sex worker since I was a child, and that when you are a femme-identified person growing up in conservative Christian fundamentalist or conservative families and communities, and this is probably would apply internationally. I just don't have as much direct lived experience in that space, but you are trained to be of service to everyone around you. And whether that's your body, your expression, your identity, your image, every single part of me was coerced and controlled from the minute I was born and put into these tiny boxes and exploited. So whether I was actually being trafficked, if we're going to use that language, or I was just, a being dressed up and told what to do, I've been engaging in sexual commerce since I was a child and used as a tool. And so I think in some ways, whether that was erotic labor or emotional labor, that's the work I've been trained to do since I was very young in my families and then I was in a fundamentalist Christian space where it was very, very distinctly trained. This is how you will perform, how you will exist. Yeah. In that Christian space, I already was very, easily adept to I am everyone's social worker and therapist. That was already my identity. And then in the Christian space, they decided I was going to be a social worker in terms of my career so that I could do mission work. I was going on mission trips all over the world, and they decided I would go to college to do evangelism, proselytizing in college spaces by getting a social work degree. So even though I was making weird art and really loved art, I couldn't do these things I wanted. I was sort of dictated to be on this path to do social work. And then I was leading Bible studies and being, unluckily, my first social work job was working in child welfare systems, doing child abuse protection and removing kids from their homes as a 22-year-old white girl in the Midwest who didn't know anything about kids or families, and mostly in communities of color, which was so toxic and harmful and really devastating to those communities. And I have deep sadness about having played that role. But I did that role related to that role for 10 years. And in growing in that role, I mostly learned that everything was bullshit in the context of using systems to oppress and control and coerce people and using them to decide who is safe and who can have their children and what is right. And that it was all conformity to white supremacy and conformity to classism and racism and sexism. And I was also doing that work in my own body, in my own life, as I was in this cult still and in an arranged marriage while I'm working as a social worker.
Whoa.
So luckily on the personal level, I had these fucking great coworkers who were like, hey girl, you're in an abusive relationship. And like, while I'm like doing domestic violence work with clients, they're like, that's like here. And so my first time, like, I had this beautiful coworker who like would like take me out. The first time I ever like went out to a bar and like got dressed up and put on makeup. Like this like person when I was 25 who like helped me be a person. So like in the transition from like both understanding how like the clinical systems were really fucked up from a very early age, like it always felt like this is not in alignment. Like I'm a white girl in the Midwest who's really Christian, yet I still felt like, there's no truth when it comes to Jesus. Like there's no right way to be, and there's no truth when it comes to well-being in the world, like one way of being. And so I was always like, I don't understand how people have decided there is one way to be and why we now are going to like force people using systems to create that. And I couldn't understand how social workers could actually do that work and like stay in that work. And like I think this all the time actually about therapists now, where I'm like, how do you tell people that they are crazy when they're responding to a really fucked up, broken system that's coercing and controlling and harming them? How do you perpetuate every day that this is your diagnosis and I'm going to give you coping skills for the next 5 years for this diagnosis? Like, how do you survive in that? Like, how do you ethically, like, I'm sure you have this experience though in training.
Well, that's why I tell them, I'm like, the system's messed up. You shouldn't have to be working 3 jobs and then having anxiety because you don't have any time for yourself because you can't afford your home, right? Like, hold on, it's not you, that's the system there.
Yeah. How many therapists like
don't do that? Yeah.
I had this conversation with a therapist. Actually, I was living in Idaho briefly and it was fucking toxic and terrible. But I met this like dude therapist who had a big practice there doing, I don't know what he was doing, fucking CBT or some fucking shit. And I asked him like, what is his relationship to managing oppression and like, you know, the rights of marginalized identities in his practice. And he was like, I pretty much see the what was the term he used? The well-off or something. He's like, I see the people who are, they're doing pretty well. Those things don't really affect them. And so they're not really my clients. I just see the people who are like struggling with, some depression or some anxiety. And I was like,
you don't see it.
Yeah. But like the fact that a therapist could be working in this field and like not have an awareness that like marginalization or identities are going to impact every single client they encounter in some way, even if they're maybe the cause of the oppression, it's still something impacting them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of people like that. I think that's just the reality, is that a lot of people don't see what you and I are talking about. And that's part of why I hope this podcast can do that. I hope these conversations can do that, just to be expanding the awareness of the reality that, we are fish living in the water of oppression.
Totally.
All of us.
Yeah. And no one is free of that. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Right. And so being able to help people see that, because it's so tricky though, because to get insurance coverage for someone who can't afford, and this is with people who even can afford insurance, right? But to do that, you have to diagnose someone with something, but like, I think that's where at least I'm trying to challenge it, of like sitting with someone and say, like, what diagnosis feels comfortable to you? This is how we get access to services. Let's talk about it. This is not a definition. This does not define you. There are other reasons why this is occurring, whether it's society, whether it's your early family relationships, whether it's the current relationships you're in. It is not you. It is not you.
Right.
Ugh.
Well, and I think that the question I always ask therapists, I'm doing supervision for therapists now primarily. And I ask this question, like, when you are giving information to a client about their mental illness, about their experience, about how to understand what's happening to them, how is it benefiting you to perpetuate that information? Like, how are you thinking about the way that we stay in an ethical practice? We think about like being rooted and boundaried in our ethics and values. Nothing we should be saying to a client should be for our benefit, to perpetuate our ego, our identification in the career, our identification with where we're doing something that's valuable, we're important, or we're useful, like all the shit that like perpetuating the diagnostics, the systems that are harmful within mental health is about the therapist's sense of self, right? And so our ability to disconnect from that, to like disconnect from like this story we have about, I need to be doing a good job by following evidence-based practice, by giving them this diagnostic, by making them better, that like, if we can disconnect from that, there is this fucking transformation that can happen as the therapist to say, we're just fucking humans in the room with you and we're on this journey and let's like see where we go. Cause like, I don't know. And you don't know. And like, I somehow have a brain that can maybe help you with some things. And I got some ideas. I often joke that my therapist technique is like, I'm Sam from Lord of the Rings and like the client is Frodo and like, they got the ring, they got the plan, they got the like the goals. I'm just like along. I got a map. I got some snacks, got some ideas, but like, we're just fucking in it together. And like, we're going to this like through the depths of Mordor. Like, we're fucking in it. And like,
Right.
that's where like we can be transformational for clients, where you're not needing to reinforce our power in the room.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I start to think about my work with psychedelic assisted psychotherapy and this concept of the inner healer and being able to sit back and support people in that work of bringing up what is coming up for them that they need to heal and holding that with them, right? Like, there's such a sitting back of that experience of, instead of let me talk to you and direct you for this entire session, sitting back and supporting them to go where they want to go and then holding that in a safe container. But I think it's tricky too, because there are obviously like clients that can be supported through, basic things. I mean, I don't practice from a CBT lens, but like just basic thoughts of CBT that are helpful of like, let's challenge these thoughts. Let's use mindfulness to like ground in this and be able to connect back to the body and take a deep breath and like, but those skills could be shared in a book, right? Like those skills can be shared in a workshop that can be on YouTube for everybody. My dream and hope is that we could have a future, and I think this is going to be way beyond our future, but a world where people don't need a therapist anymore because our community has healed enough to hold one another.
Totally. Yeah. And then that's your example. Like, and like, why don't we give it away for free? Like, give it all away. Like, here's nothing, none of this is privileged knowledge, right? Like, here's a bunch of tools. Like, there's CBT apps, there's all the shit is like ideas, strategies for managing and coping. But the actual transformational stuff is within you. And I always say, like, the reason that therapists even exist is because we lost community. Like, we stopped being with each other. And so we needed to create therapists so we had people to talk to. Clinical work didn't exist in most of human history. There wasn't like this person that was identified to be this thing for you. There are different versions of healers, but even those healers weren't sitting with you and listening to you vent about your problems all day. Like, I think about this a lot when therapists will come to me as a supervisor and say, I've been seeing this client for like 2 years and we're just really stuck. And I was like, why the fuck are you seeing a client for 2 years? There's a difference between, you need someone to talk to. You need emotional support. You need community. You need belonging. You need reflection. You need people that vibe with you. You don't need a therapist. You don't need somebody in a power dynamic that you're paying to be that community and emotional support for you. And if you're not making progress after, 6 months in clinical work with somebody, it's probably not the right fit and it's probably not helping. And you probably need other people in your life. But like, people like this illusion, right? That I can pay this person every week who's going to be unbiased and give me the support that I need. And I don't have to feel like I need to give them anything back. And I don't need to like have any weird relational dynamics. And it's like, but we just need to get better at relationships and better at having meaningful connections and community. Sorry, that was a side tangent.
No, it's fair. It's super fair. And I think I'm sitting with it because I'm someone who has been in therapy for the last 5 years. And I would say I've made a ton of progress. I would like to think. Yeah. So it hasn't been static, but it is something that I continue to do and enjoy as a like special container, as a special place for someone who has held my story for the last 5 years in a way of them trying to support me to be the best that I can. Yeah, could I and should I maybe be doing that in community? Yes, but do I also like the sanctity of a special container where I can just go and be held in that? But like, maybe you're right. Maybe it is that like, if I had like a deeper embedded community of being held and seen, I'd be building those relationships with other people and I wouldn't need that one person. I think it's just, I like to unburden myself in the sanctity of that spiritual space.
Totally.
But I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and it's certainly no judgment. And I'm a kind of a bossy bitch, which makes me, either a really good dom or a really terrible therapist. But I mean, it's a space where like we want to figure out like what are, I tell clients all the time, like, know exactly what you want from this experience. And like, if you don't know what you want to like see change or see grow and shift, like we're not going to do a good job in this space. You're not ready for this experience. And I think kind of maybe coming full circle to like my clinical road, having been in really toxic like systems roles, both as social worker, as managers, as a trainer for foster parents, as a therapist for foster kiddos, as somebody running a group practice, running private practices, I worked for an online therapy company and worked for all the therapy apps. I worked for, just recently left a job as a clinical director of a adolescent treatment center. We're having worked really intensely in formal systems. The constant experience I have is in order for the systems to survive, for the people in those systems to survive financially, economically, in our current capitalist, patriarchal, oppressive structure, we have to cause harm to the people in those systems in order to perpetuate that survival. And that's at every level. There's very few therapy jobs where we're not engaging in exploitation. And so then there's this like core difficulty for me too, right? Because therapists need to survive. We need to make money. We need to like have income too. But how do we not engage in oppression in a way that is going to be perpetuating the very thing that we are trying to, we idealize the idea that we are creating something different and we are being something different, and changing systems from within is a great vision. Does not happen very often. Very, very like 1% of the time can you actually make a difference from within a toxic system. If anything, it's like we all stop working in them. Like I would love to see therapists, great example, stop working for the therapy apps. Like they're super toxic. Stop working for systems that aren't working for the humans that we're trying to serve. Figure out a better way that we can survive and support each other. Part of it goes back to like we're in an industry where I think with this a lot actually with sex work, that any job that is a caretaking role, whether it's therapy or nursing or teaching or sex work, is not paid well enough to survive.
Yeah,
because of the patriarchy. And yet, if you're in marketing, if you're in accounting, if you're in law, you can have crazy billable rates and companies pay that, and it's like no big deal.
Yeah,
there's a systemic shift, but it's also like we have to separate ourselves from the relationship that we get to being important in the work enough to like try to change the system, to not want to keep reinforcing it so we feel important.
Right, which I think part of that means not diagnosing people when it's a problem of the system or a problem of their relational dynamics and other sorts of things that perpetuate this sort of need-based, you need to come back to me because you have this problem and you got this diagnosis in this way. What I think is interesting, like as I'm trying to get out of the system, right, like offering coaching services and get outside of that system, like wouldn't the dream be to like charge the people who can afford that and then provide sliding scale for the rest? And then we don't have to do it in a system of therapy, and we don't have to do it in a system of insurance, and we don't have to do it in that sort of way. But then that's still charging $300 a session. But for the people who could afford it, this is very like socialist trying to rework it or offering group dynamics that are more affordable. Like totally. I don't know what to do, but I want to get out of this system.
Totally. That's a model that a lot of people are using, where they'll have a sliding scale for folks who can, and then charging other clients more. The kind of work that we want to be doing is not the kind of work that will pay us, and the kind of work that nourishes us, that like feeds our soul to like, I want to sit with someone in deep sexual trauma and work through like how to find their fantasy expression that is going to like use their trauma as a tool for integration. Like that's like my passion work is like, like think through trauma work. But like the folks who want that, who need that work, who want to be on that journey with me, can't afford it usually.
Right.
And they can't afford to have access to that. And so I'm trying to think of other strategies. Like I'm trying to publish a bunch of free shit. I'm trying to do some streaming. I'm trying to find some other ways to like give the thing that is really needed to people in a way that is as accessible as possible. Because none of this should be privileged knowledge.
I know.
Everyone should have access to it.
Yes, I agree. I 100% agree. And I do still think that we need relationships, though. That's the tricky part, is like you could read all of the books in the world, which do form a sense of relationship, but you still need someone to look at you and be like, that was a good job that you did. Or maybe that's an area where we could push a little bit, because the reality is the book is not dynamic. Like we still need relationships. And so like, even if we put out all this free content, the podcast free content, right? Like that can only get someone so far until it's applicable to their life. I don't know. I've been sitting in this and feeling shitty about it left and right and not knowing what to do, because you do have to make money in this society to survive, but also seeing this so directly of how it is the relationships that shape our sense of self and how we feel. And I am just one piece of that. And the reality is someone needs a full community that can hold them with that emotional well-being. And that is what's going to transform them. So like, even with the people that really want to do the work, the reality is like, I am just one relationship. And through that work, at least through my own work with my therapist, I started to realize how my other relationships don't hold space for me like that. Right. And so I slowly start to evolve and change and be like, okay, I'm going to close these down because it doesn't feel like this one. The reality is we should all be held in that.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I like a lot of my life. I'm mostly doing sex work right now because I feel better in the clear negotiation of my labor in sex work than I do in the exploitation of therapy. Because and it's interesting, like, because therapists are so appalled by this distinction, but it's like, I can go into a session with a client and I can say, this is the thing I can do. This is what this is. And I can be my fullest self. I can have all my thoughts, my feelings, my opinions. This is how I'm going to show up. I will give a caveat. I do sex work in a pretty privileged position where I'm not doing street-based work. I'm not feeling the same kind of threat of violence as some do. I do have multiple stalkers at times. I do have lots of online harassment at times, but it's not the same kind of threat that others but like I can clearly negotiate. This is what I'm willing to do. This is what I want. This is what it's going to look like. Goodbye. Give me your, this is the rate. And it's I know that I'm offering a valuable service and a commodity to this person that is really like meaningful and connected. Whereas in therapy, there's often times where you're like, I hear this from supervisees all the time. They walk away from a session like, was that helpful? Did I do the right thing? And then they spend, and then a client has a negative reaction and comes back, and then they spend all this time in this kind of like machinations around, am I fucking this up? And it's like, you're not fucking it up. This is really hard work, and you're trying to fill the role of a community. You're trying to be all of those things for people that we cannot be. And I think that speaks to like therapists not existing in the vacuum, that we need the connection with community organizers and mutual aid organizations and groups that are doing the like, how do we help people be in communities and learn to feel supported and cared for? But also I see that I have some optimism that like in the UGC, that user-generated content world, that there's space for like moving into owning all of our own content and distributing it in a way that is equitable and fair, moving out of a space where like we need to continue to feed a system that isn't serving us. And so I'm looking into like a lot of like, I'm working on some like Web3, some cryptocurrency, like blockchain projects that will actually work on like user ownership of content and user ownership of our own voices, our own experiences, where we can create our own communities outside of that structure. That's just one strategy that is a potential. A lot of the money being made in the world right now is on user-generated content, because most big companies are moving to influencer, kind of like us making their marketing for them. Mm-hmm. And so if we were actually being paid well for all of that content and using it to improve relationships and well-being of the people that are consuming it, and like having it be content that's actually like really rooted in like what humans are needing to connect and to grow. My dream is always like, I want to help everybody get better at sex and dating, everybody better at relationships, better at community, better at boundaries, better at consent, and like using all those spaces to facilitate that. Like, we're not going to eliminate the need for therapy, but we're going to create more of we already see this in like the TikTok space, right? Like how many 12-year-olds are giving relationship advice to each other and supporting each other. It's neat to see like this, a lot of people moving towards collective experience as the anchor for information and knowledge sharing versus any kind of like expert space.
Which I'm all for, the power of lived experience, right? And what that can teach you compared to what you learn in a textbook or what you learn in a system, getting a doctorate under something, right?
Yeah. And I think I'm curious, like, would you want to share what motivated you to first want to be in a helping role? Like, was there something that kind of like, because something for me, my path was chosen for me, but I'm happy to be in it, but it was very much like, here's the thing.
Yeah. So I was the first person in my family to go to college. So that was, I think, very murky. I didn't know what that was going to look like, but I wanted to do something helping people. I just felt like that felt good. I didn't know what. Originally, I wanted to be a doctor of medicine. And I think that was part of the prestige of like, oh, I'm going to be the first one to go to college and I'm going to become a doctor and I'm going to do the thing, So then that's when I started working in a hospital and doing some research work and really getting to see what it's like to be a doctor and the 15 minutes that you get with a human in, out, here's your lab results, here's some medication, goodbye. And at the same time, I was also volunteering as a sexual assault counselor. So I would go to the ER and do one-on-one crisis counseling for individuals who would come to the ER to get services afterwards, and just like felt such a radical shift between the ability to be with someone in that space compared to what you would do giving someone a lab value. And then after that, I just switched to psychology and I was like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to sit with people. I'm going to help people. And I think it's a part of why I'm so passionate like you, right? Of like, how do we help people on that whole spectrum of healing from, the sexual trauma, whether that be with whether that be through a act of violence or the societal act of violence that we all experience. I was someone who went through purity culture and fundamental Christianity as well. So I would call that a trauma. And so whatever that is, I'm very passionate about helping people go from that to sexual pleasure and being in full liberation of that. And that's what I want to do. It sounds like what you want to do. And so that's where I really resonate. And how do we help people do that?
Right. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting as you said, like this all ties back to this capitalism and like this work-related conversation, because people don't realize that one of the things that's keeping us from sexual pleasure is our relationship to work. And it's our relationship to production and to like consumption and like feeding the system of like, we're so exhausted by just trying to be every day and like and like survive. And like, and then this is true in so many cities right now where like people can't afford to live. I was doing this again. I got laid off from this or fired from this job for this toxic reason, which we could talk about. But I've been like job hunting again. If I was ever going to go back to clinical work, I'm like therapist, clinical director, supervisor, master's level, 10 years experience therapist jobs, not even $100,000, like consistently like 80, 90, that like not even. And it's like, what is the hope then in this field that if like you can go, like there's always this, like I hear this from dudes, actually male expert clients of mine who are like CEOs will often be like, well, you just gotta work hard and it'll get better. And I'm like, that is not real. Like the belief that men actually like, and I'll use men as a, I don't like gendered terminology, beings in power will have to reinforce this language, right? That like, if you just work harder, it will get better. You can hustle and like pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And it was like,
not how this world works. Yeah.
And I give that example. I'm like, I'm a brilliant human being who's worked really hard and has been at the highest level in my career. And I still can't survive without lots of other kinds of work. And the most money I ever make in like survival is sex work, is never actual clinical work, is never the like, and when businesses succeed, I think of this a lot actually, like it's one of the solutions that therapists will say. This is not turned into a business consulting podcast.
I'm about it.
One of the things therapists like, well, you got to like start your own business and you got to just like, you got to hustle and create content and have all these like other income sources. Who has time to do therapy, write a book, do supervision? There's some people out there that are fucking miracle workers, but like when you're doing all those things, are you doing the kind of quality work and the alignment that you actually want to be doing? And even then, you are selling something that may not be the actual thing you want to be engaging in. It's like you're trying to find this strategy to hustle a system that isn't actually the clinical work we're trying to do. And I didn't go into this work to be a business person hustling a system to try to like create clickbait content that's going to get like 50,000 views. So some of it's useful, but a lot of it's not useful. A lot of it's like more harmful than good just because we need to survive. And it's like, we shouldn't have to play that game too when we're trying to like really work at dismantling the system.
Yeah. And when you do start that private practice, what are you're making money off of the other clinicians, right? That you are taking part of that pay from, and that's how you're being able to get out of that system, right? And I think part of it, it just always drives me wild that like, so I was certified as a yoga instructor, right? And to teach a private yoga session, you could get upwards of $150 an hour. And right, that is also about what therapists are paid. And I'm just like, hold on a second. You're telling me 5 years of a doctorate and hours of clinical training gets the same as a 200-hour yoga teacher training, right? And the same thing with personal trainers, other sorts of this whole system of what gets paid what for what. My dream is that everyone can have access to therapy for what is helpful, right? But like, also, how do you get paid appropriately for the amount of emotional labor and the amount of emotional turmoil that you go through being that container for people? Because this job is not easy. It is not easy to hear everyone's pains and to sit with that and to go through like, get emotional, to go through like hearing so many sexual assault traumas. And then you're just like, oh, I'm just going to go about like my day is normal now after all of that. Like, what are you supposed to do?
I see you. It's really hard. And like, I say to the therapists, especially new ones in this field, like you cannot see more than 5 clients a day and stay alive. You should not be seeing clients more than 3 days a week. Like we have to balance, like you need days for rest. You need days for other kinds of work. You need days for creativity. You need space. You need space between sessions. Like if you're seeing seven clients a day for 5 days a week, like we will hurt ourselves and we don't do a good job. We don't show up with the clients because this shit is really hard. We are the social net for every other system. Like clients can't get into doctors. They can't get into healers. They can sometimes get a therapy session because insurance will sometimes cover it. So we become that net for all of the like needs they have. And we can't be it. We cannot be that. And like, you can't be that.
Right.
Like, it doesn't mean that the client doesn't need that care. It just means that like, we're not responsible for holding the weight of the whole system. And if anything, it's like, we can have compassion with that client for the griefs that we are the person they're engaging with in that moment. And then like, how do we help them get more? My first strategy actually with survivor clients, and do you want this?
Go for it. I'm here for it. Yeah.
My first strategy is we're going to work on building other community for you. Like that's our first strategy. Before we're doing any of the trauma work, we're not diving in deeply into any of it. You're not telling me your story. We're not holding anything until you have other people, because you leave here, you're here 1 hour a week.
Right.
That doesn't even scratch the surface of what you need. to like hold the depth of this work you're doing. And there's sometimes people can't wait and they just need to like, they're
put
so
it out there.
activated.
Yeah.
But then we don't go through the story. So this is not turned into a trauma podcast. I'm going to tell folks who are new to the field, we do not do trauma work and don't dive into the story. We do titration of symptoms.
Yes.
Initially. And so what you're doing is just how do you help with that activation, moving through the polyvagal response stuff. You're moving through how do we helping them decrease the intensity of that activation before you're doing any storytelling, because they can't, and that's where like your ability to hold that container is less about you need to hold the whole story, right? And more that like you get to pace them effectively so that they're not causing themselves more harm or harming you either.
Yes, that's what I've been learning is how to do pacing and like the importance of that before because some people do just want to go there and you're just like, hold on, do you have grounding skills? Are you going to walk out of this room feeling so dysregulated that you don't come back?
Totally.
Sort of basic stuff. But I love even taking it back and to a whole different level of, do you have community? Where is your community? Where's your support? Where are you going after this? Do you have enough people to talk about this besides me? Right.
Totally.
But it's so crazy as someone who's in the system. Like I was just interviewing for training spots next year and I decided to stay at the place I'm at because they're at a very different system than what the other place is. One of the other places, 14 clients a week for 2 days on site, which means 7 on 7 back-to-back clients. And that's for someone who's in school. So you're not only just doing that, you're also balancing all of the demands of trying to get your schooling and hours and your dissertation and blah, 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 blah.
Which is like common. Like that's not any common. That's like, I mean, there's a place in the city that I lived in that you had 90 clients starting out as an intern. You started out with, you had 90 clients in a public, mostly Medicare clients. And you had to fill every billable hour. Like if you missed an hour, you were hustling to get a client in that slot. It was
This is wild.
And it was, and being paid like, $30 an hour.
And that's exactly the piece, getting paid that amount for the amount of pain that you're sitting with and holding.
Insane.
Yes.
Yeah. Insane. Well, one comment I wanted to make based on what you just shared too is like, but the pacing is really important and learning the titration of like, when do we go into activation? But also there's a piece of this that I think people really struggle with. Your therapist experience has to be rooted in your own presence with the client. And so like the minute that like therapists work really hard to hold the like, I'm put on my therapist hat today and I'm a professional and I'm supposed to be these things. And when we don't notice our own activation, when we aren't able to like stay and connected to our own bodies, like the minute that I have a like feeling in session, I'm hitting pause. I'm hitting pause in the conversation. I'm hitting pause on myself. I'm hitting pause to say like, what's happening for me? Even if that's just like hey, can I have a second to a client? But the more integrated and grounded you are in doing your own personal work around being connected, the better work you're going to do. Because when you move past that, when you're just sort of like, when you're in the fit therapy factory, client after client after client, and you're dysregulated, you're disconnected. What the fuck are we even doing then? Why are we even there? Like then we're just like, they should just be using a therapy app then. But if the solution is that we need to be disconnected to survive, then this isn't the work that we want to be doing. And there's this opportunity to like have it be better just by slowing down enough to say, even if you're having a hard day, like there's going to be days where you're not fucking there. And we can be honest with the client. Like I think a lot about what do we tell a client about our experience in an ethical way that doesn't make it about us.
Yeah.
So we can be honest with our experience without making it, they're not holding space for you. You're just being real with like, how are we both coming to this space? And every other relationship, I think of this a lot with therapists, right? Every other relationship in your life, we tell people to do that. We teach people to do that. But somehow in the therapy context, we become this robotic, like performative, because there's so much fear around like, what does being a professional mean? And we will show up better for clients when we're real and authentic in our experience than we would ever be by being a disconnected therapist machine feeding CBT tools to them.
Yes. This is why I love relational cultural theory. Yeah. So it talks so much about the importance of being connected in session and watching those moments when you do feel disconnected as either, something's coming up for me about maybe my own traumas, my own bias, or something has happened with the client and our sort of connection, and being able to monitor that as the key piece of what growth is. So I love that you're saying this because that's where I'm trying to come from too. And I think what's really great about that orientation is trying to take off the power dynamics of presuming that I know where this person needs to go or what's wrong with them. It's a collaborative thing, and being able to just be authentic. That is a crucial part of the therapy, right? And authenticity within the frame of what's always best for the client, right? So like you said, like you can say like, this is where I'm showing up today. And it's not that the person is caretaking for you. It doesn't go to the opposite direction where now it's like, can we talk about this, me and my pain? It's like, no, I'm just going to state that's where I'm at today. And we can honor that and continue forward as an authentic relationship with one another. And that's actually how you do the therapy.
Totally. And I think that speaks to like, there's not many modalities that kind of give space for that. And it's like moving out of the, we need to stick to this, we need a format, and more about like, what are we actually trying to do here? And like most people's difficulties that they come to therapy for are relational, like something about their relationships with each other, with family, with with themselves, with their relationship. And so our ability to like model what it's like to be in healthy relationship dynamics, and like we often are their first healthy attachment relationship they might be experiencing. And which might speak to your earlier conversation about why you're still in therapy for 5 years.
Hit me with my psychodynamic.
So like, right, we have this relationship, and we build this attachment, we build this safety. Like the therapist becomes our first person that's reflecting that back to us. And then we're like, oh, what does it mean to like have repair, have breaks, have a bad day, have some of my most transformative client sessions I ever had were clients when they were like, hey, you're on some fuck shit. Like, hey, you missed this. Like, hey, this like, and then that's what we fucking need when like we're in exchange. It's like that. We think about this in kink a lot, where like there's a dynamic energy feeding the system. There's this tension of energy, whatever role you are, dominant or submissive, like you're putting in energy to feed the system, and then it's being received and fed back to you.
Right.
Feedback loop. And therapy also has to be a feedback loop. So if clients are just dumping on us, and I hear crazy stories of what therapists do sometimes from other clients that come to me, and like sometimes I'm astounded, but I've heard stories from clients of therapists who say nothing for an entire session besides like, okay, well, I'll see you next week. That was great. Like no other words. Or therapists who will only do CBT, who like, well, which CBT, which thought dysfunction does that fall under? Okay, now let's do the thought restructuring. Like they won't do any other model, but besides like this, it's like, what are we even?
Which is where I ask, like, what's that person? Like, what's the therapist's level of comfortability with being in a relationship and being a human, right? That I think that if you are uncomfortable with that and this sort of communication, presence, authenticity, do you know how much easier it is to be like, well, we're going to do a CBT worksheet today and just lay it out right here and do that. But the reality is that only gets you so far. That might stop those anxious thoughts, that might stop this and get you in some sort of movement. But the long-term relational attachment, my 5 years of therapy stuff of like learning how to push back with my therapist and go through ruptures and repairs and still be held in that. Yeah, that is not on a worksheet. That is not on a worksheet.
Totally. And then the related stuff, like how many therapists, their clients I hear talk about therapists that will be like directly like shaming or pathologizing of like them because it like impacts like their view of themselves. And I mean, I come to this in sex therapy all the time, where clients come to me because I'm the most radical they can find on the internet, and will validate, any way that they are expressing themselves, generally speaking. But they'll come to me and say like that, therapists that have encouraged them, like, I can't tell you how many times I hear of therapists who will encourage involuntary celibacy. Like one partner is like, I don't want to have sex anymore. And the therapist like, well, you need to stay with your partner and preserve the relationship no matter what. Happens all the fucking time. Therapists like don't value sexual expression. Therapists that don't value, it's their own ideology. They need to present their vision of what a family is, what belonging is, what marriage is, what like connection is and safety is. And it's like, until we're willing to deconstruct all of our sense of what normative and right is, we can't do good work with anybody. Like we're continuously like fucking this up. And I mean, really popular at therapist conferences, just like, I'm not telling everyone, we don't need to say that like everything the Gottman says is bullshit, but like there is some space to say like, what would it mean to like eliminate normativity? Like whether that's gender or neurodivergency or relational diversity, like there is no normativity. There is healthy. There is meaningful, there is connection, there's safety, there's, pleasure. And the way that those things can fall into a million different configurations and connections and belonging, and have historically in human history. And yet we've somehow forgot about that in the last 100 years because of white supremacy and the patriarchy.
Because it is exactly what you said, of what the therapist views to be normal is what they're going to come in and be like, well, at first off, I don't think a therapist should be telling you should be doing this. Let's get really clear on that, right? But like, no matter what, even if you're not blatantly be like, you should stay in that relationship, it comes through in the bias of the questions that you ask, in the gentle direction that you're trying to lead them. And that is just a reality. And this is also where I'm like, damn, like I want to know what's my therapist's perspective on the world. What sort of relationships do you think are healthy? what sort of
Totally.
sex do you think is healthy? Are you kink shaming and I don't even know it? Do you know what I mean? And like it's coming
Totally.
through in these small little questions and the way you frame. Like, I want your full bio. Otherwise, I don't feel safe to sit down with you personally.
Yeah, totally. Again, you're not a cog in the machine. Like, you're a human being that's having. So even if you try to be distant, it's interesting. Therapists that try to be distancing and like very professional, but then suddenly that goes out the window when it comes to sex and relationships. And then suddenly there's all this personal bias that they like, oh, now I have an opinion about you and your identity. But like, I didn't a minute ago when you were like struggling with systemic oppression. Like, then I was just like, oh, that's really hard. Let's talk about a CBT strategy.
Right.
But the minute it's relational, it's like, well, let's talk about why you should preserve your relationship.
Right. Absolutely. And I think part of that is related to the reality that we just don't talk about sex in our culture. At least as someone currently in training, I will say there has been no conversation about sexuality. There is no class on sex and relationships. There is no any of that. And so, to be quite frank, there are many people who have gone through trainings, and there are people in my classes who have never even heard of kink or non-monogamy. And so when they sit down with a client who comes from that, everything is going to flood out. Oh, you have a rape fantasy? Oh my God, something is going on there, right? Like, so all of that just floods out because we don't talk about it.
Totally. I would give anybody this test. You're a therapist, clinical person in any regard. Look back at your curriculum. 99% of courses in clinical work have nothing sex and gender related. Well, they've just started to add some like weird like LGBT stuff, just even like maybe one semester, one class, but almost nothing sex and gender related. So it's like, how do we like ignore this entire swath of like identities of human beings and then expect people to do a good job holding space for any of them in that context? And then people don't want to get the help and training in it. One of the projects I want to just plug that I'm working on is a certification training therapists how to treat sex workers as clients. And it's a 12-week certification that we are going to be exhaustively going through. You're going to be getting sex work clients that we're going to be supervising you and facilitating and checking into the clients. Are you doing a good job? We're going to be giving exams. We're going to be doing a full assessment of you at the end. Like, we're going to help you be a better fucking therapist so that you don't harm sex workers in your communities. I want every therapist organization to start requiring their therapists to attend these kinds of programming. We will come to I will come to the APA and do sex work trainings. Everybody needs access to sex workers specifically are a marginalized identity that's completely eliminated from most conversations. So there's a little bit of queerness happening, a little bit around race happening, but almost nothing happening around sex work. And it is an identity trait. It is not just a choice of work that somebody had. Because once someone's a sex worker, it is an identity trait that stays with them forever and impacts every single part of their being in the same way that sex or race does.
Mm-hmm. And I think the reality is it's more common these days, right? Especially with the tools like the internet to be able to share your content.
Totally.
I am so happy that you have this certification or are doing this. And I get so pessimistic when I am going through my training and I realize that in the APA requirements for a psychologist, even a trauma class is not required. And like my school is one of only like 4 schools that has that as part of their curriculum. So I'm over here like, we need to have, I know. I'm over here like, we need to have a class on sex. And I'm like, oh, like, fuck, like we don't even have a class on trauma. So maybe I need to lower my standards. It's kind of where I've been feeling.
But what are they even teaching? Like, what are we even like?
I spent a month on the Rorschach, okay? I spent a month and a half on the Rorschach and how to interpret someone based on what they say on an ink blot, okay?
Oh, God. Like how much of that time could have been used to like, learn something more useful about like humans and experiences? Like, so I would ask the question, like when you're going through that, what is it reinforcing to you that they're trying to prove? Like, what are they needing to validate about themselves as psychologists that they're needing to like create this academic system that validates this sense of importance? Or what do you take away from that?
Yeah, that test was created by white men and tested on white men and then used for a whole different patient population and used to pathologize people and to look at your certain ink blot and say, well, that's because you have this sort of tendency. And I'm just like, what the?
Yeah.
Are you kidding me?
And it's about like the needing to like, I'm important and I'm saying this thing that is valid and meaningful to you. And it's like, I love the fun fact that Freud did a lot of psychedelics.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
I mean, right? Like, so we're going to talk about like psychology. Like, they were not fucking, but they were doing there was a lot of opium, there was a lot of Dilaudid, there was a lot of psychedelics, there was a lot of like cocaine. Like, there's a lot of like, they're tripping and be like, oh, I'm gonna give you my opinions about the world. And because I have power and money and class and access, my opinions somehow become a book and become valid. And it's like how often do we think about like the person who gets to write the book, you know, is the one that like is teaching this thing, when it's like we're trying to be fucking human and trying to be in our experience. And like I was at this tech event this week that was like, I'm trying to do some like networking for this Web3 project I'm trying to build, and this tech bro was like went in this rant about how our cities are just designed around car manufacturers, and cars are really the reason why our cities are the way they are. And I was like, do you ever think about there being more systemic issues beyond like car manufacturers? Like the idea that the American dream was sold to us as a marketing scheme to like suppress and control us and like isolate us out of communities and out of belonging and out of women achieving more power. But it was like people get so narrowly focused on like this one thing is a truth, and it's usually around like their own experience versus like here's someone else's fucking story, here's someone else's like experiences and words, and therapy is a great place to like. Of all the fields that we're going to liberate from patriarchal capitalist systems, why not fucking clinical systems? We're literally, our values are aligned with equity, justice, care for all, identity. Like, let's fucking do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's why I think I come back to that question of how, right? Like how do we do that? And again, it's something that I don't have the answer for. And I think, you know, people like us will continue to push and to think about that and try and rework the systems, and also trying to have some sort of grounding for the reality that it's not going to change overnight, as much as we dream of this world of it not being like this. And like, yeah, like how do we take care of ourselves? What is it they're saying, like fighting within the system and against at the same time? And like, how do you do that in a way that allows you, you know, as a warrior in that space, to take care of yourself and do good work? I mean, oh,
yeah, it's hard. Yeah. This is an unpopular answer, but I mean, part of it is we stop doing it in the way that we're doing it, and we change it. You know, we don't feed insurance companies. We don't feed corporate mental health. You know, we don't participate in mental health that's oppressive. Like, we don't feed systems and models and tools and academia even, you know, like there's so many aspects of the clinical systems that are oppressive and perpetuate the same harms, you know, that we're trying to learn, so that we're trying to shift, and being honest with our clients, being really direct about what we have to do and why we have to do it. I mean, super basic. I mean, not doing mandatory reporting anymore. Like, mandatory reporting is harmful and harms families and harms people. So there's so many other strategies to protect children and protect survivors and prevent harm that is not mandatory reporting. So, you know, like there's really basic shit we can do differently as a field, and we can work together on coming up with new strategies that are actually community-based responses, that are actually like rooted in what's good for people. When I talk to therapists, I often hear this response of like, well, this is what I'm supposed to do. I'm terrified of losing my license. I'm terrified of liability. Have we really designed a career on helping people based entirely around liability management? Like, we're not in risk averse of like insurance systems. We're not lawyers. We're not police, which what a big problem we run into with sex work monitoring. People like think they need to report their clients for doing sex work. I'm like,
what?
Remember, yeah, I've heard some therapists that they're supposed to like, well, if your client's doing something illegal, like, what are you supposed to do?
That is not at all what's within the ethic code at all. Not even close.
Totally. But therapists are often afraid that if they know their clients are doing something illegal, that they should report it. And it's like, you're not a fucking like up and deputized by the like local like, problematic police force to like report your like marginalized client for something because you have a little ick about it. Like, that's your shit to move through.
Yes.
Like, so it's interesting, like therapists changing our reference point to like, if we're every day we're afraid of liability management, and that's how we like perform this job, like, we're not doing it well and we're not serving our clients well.
Well, totally. As someone who's been making this podcast, the amount of things I've said on this podcast that I've been like, oh shit, what happens if I lose, like, and my supervisor was like, maybe you don't get your license, maybe you don't do it because of that, because apparently even if you let your license fault, and you no longer keep it activated with all of the education requirements, you can still be held liable as someone who has a license. So I was like, oh shit, maybe I don't want to get my license because I can't just like recommend things to people because of the framework. Like, and especially it comes a lot with psychedelic stuff and like what I know to be truth with these things and within the system that we have. And I'm just like, I can't speak the truth. I can't speak the truth.
I keep my license so that I can do supervision for people. That's like currently like the only strategy that I'm keeping. But I'm definitely I'll be ilk. Like, I'm sure at some point I'm going to have it revoked by someone for some reason. So this recent job that fired me, they were threatening to report my license to the board another like nail in the coffin of this bullshit from this company. And it was like, the reason why they're coming after me in like all the ways they are is because I was pushing back on their bullshit. I was challenging racist, transphobic, sexist things in the company. And like when you challenge the patriarchy, they react more strongly because they're threatened to lose their power, and they push back. And like, I'm happy to be out of that system, but I'm also like deeply saddened that it is harming children in the process.
Yeah. If you're comfortable for the listener, could you just like include them in on what that was? Yeah.
Yeah. I was a clinical director for a adolescent residential treatment center. I've worked in residential before, and residential is an entirely toxic system, but I also needed to navigate capitalism. And I was like, I'm going to make a difference. I'm going to bring in sex and gender work. I'm going to talk about liberation work. I'm going to create a system where they feel safe and connected. I'm going to do trauma-based work in residential. And this is in California, in a private company. Pretty quickly from like day one, they were reacting to, they knew who I was and what I did. They were reacting to me facilitating groups that were sex and gender related. So they told me I couldn't do groups anymore. They told me that I was turning the kids trans, and the parents were going to be mad, that the conservative families weren't ready for that kind of change. They wouldn't allow the buildings themselves to be gender shifted. So they required kids to be living in facilities based on what their assigned gender at birth was. They weren't able to be like living in homes with other kids they were aligned with. So this constant pushback. But I just kept trying to like figure out my strategies. All the trauma-based approaches that I created were destroyed or not allowed to be enacted because they didn't fall within their systems. So I was just doing the best I could with one-on-one work. And I had a private therapy session with a client where where she'd been sexually assaulted many times. And we were talking about like, how do you manage that? And how do you manage arousal and desire? And in our conversation, it came down to like, she didn't understand her own body. She didn't understand what she liked. She didn't know how to have pleasure in her sexual experiences. So sex was about attention. It was about belonging. It was about being wanted. Yeah. She didn't actually like or feel good in any of the experiences. So I was like, let's do some really basic sex ed. So I brought in my vulva puppet. I'm going to show this to you.
Yeah, totally.
I brought in a vulva puppet. That's a really beautiful, like,
absolutely.
And it gives you like structures and you can talk about it. I did like a 5-minute, like little basic sex ed. This is how your body works. This is what your body needs. When your body's giving you this cue, this might be what it means. This is how you set a boundary when somebody's pushing you. This is what this is how to ask for what you might like. This is how you might explore what you might like. Super basic sex ed I would give to a 10-year-old, probably, as young as a child as young as 10. She told someone else in the facility, just as like a nice thing. She was like, oh, I got to have this thing with Angie, like, that she was excited about it. And some other staff reported me. And the next day I had like mob squad style, these guys in my office, took my laptop, took my phone, deleted all my content, all the work I had created, escorted me out. No goodbye to the clients, no transition to the community, no goodbye to my staff. I was facilitating supervision for 3 other staff, escorted me out of the building, wrote me a letter saying that I was in violation of my ethics because I was teaching children to pleasure themselves. And then it said they're going to file a board complaint against me in California.
I don't have any words.
And I'm a certified sex therapist with like years of experience. Like this is my actual expertise. If I can't do basic sex ed in a private therapy session with a teenager who's being sexually assaulted, like what other answer would I have had for this kid? I keep thinking about that actually. It's like, what else could I have said to this person, right? Like, oh, maybe in a year you can get some sex ed when you leave the facility. Like there's no other ethical answer I could have given her besides healthy, supportive sex ed that would teach her how to have control over her body and autonomy and access to her own pleasure. And like the most devastating thing for me about the situation is she's going to go away thinking that what she said was bad, what she did was bad. She's going to be reinforced that she can't talk about sex. She can't talk about her experiences. She can't get help because it led to somebody being terminated because she talked about it again. And like, she was terrified to share it with me in the first place. And it was like me saying, this is a safe space for you. This is a place you get to be. This is a place you get to work through and we can help you. You can go back to your life and have healthy relationships and sex someday. Actually is not true when you're in the mental health system as a teenager. Yeah, devastating. And I didn't get to just even be like, it's not your fault. You're doing your best. Like I wanted to get, and I'm sure my colleagues, I hope my colleagues did that on my behalf because I didn't have any legal recourse to like have any conversation with them. I couldn't even just a goodbye. I like couldn't, the company wasn't going to let me. So it was really sad, devastating.
It's horrendous is what it is.
And that's just like that's like basic mental health, but reinforce like why I don't want to work in the systems and why the systems are toxic and bad.
Right. Because I think they're like, oh, it's a child. You can't talk about that stuff. But the reality is this child has been sexually assaulted. this is a part of the conversation.
And they're coming to me with it. It was like I volunteered it. It was like this kid being like, what do I do with all this arousal and desire and like difficulty I'm having? Like, what is this about? I'm like, this is your actual job. Like,
Right.
right.
Right. Not to say, sorry, you're too young for this conversation and just leave them. What? And on top of that, we know, even through this conversation, what we've talked about, the attachment that occurs, and for them to completely shut you off with no termination from the rest of your clients, that is causing harm. Like I straight up feel the unethicalness of even that.
Yeah, it was so harmful. It was so sad. I like think about this client all the time and just like wishing I could have just, said goodbye. Said like, you're important. You're doing your best. You're on this journey together. And I didn't get to like, yeah, so unethical. But it's like private mental health is that way because they see it as a company versus a clinical experience. They're not, the company doesn't abide by therapy ethics. The company isn't rooted in ethics. The company is on some fuck shit about money. And like the week before this happened, they had just been bought out by a capital investment, by an equity firm from the East Coast. So I'm sure somebody had like probably deep Googled me and decided I was too edgy for them and they wanted a strategy to fire me. That's my like sneaking suspicion that there was some other reason that they like didn't like, because I was out about doing sex work to them. They knew that I had some sex work experience. I wasn't doing it as like actively at the time, but
I mean, it wouldn't surprise me for something like that, for them to try and push you out because of these things.
Yeah. Anyone who listens to this, I would love to like maybe write something. I'm just not this super great at the like I'm a much better verbal communicator. So, but I'd love to like do a little like further deep diving into like, can children get any help with sexuality in mental health spaces? And like, I know in schools they can't talk about it. Like teachers and like guidance counselors are very much like they can't have basic sex ed conversations. Clinicians are, if they're in an organization, they're not allowed to talk about it. Like, where do kids get the help then? Internet has some great resources, but also some bad ones. And so like, what do we do to like, hopefully the kids on TikTok are giving each other good information because I don't know where else they're going to get it.
Right. And the reality that you still, even with that, you need a relationship to be able for that kid to say what they feel about that or any sort of give and back and take, and being able to have that safe space to talk about that. One of our basic bodily autonomies, pleasure, and especially with children who have been sexually assaulted.
It's insane. There's a ton of like good like sex ed content out there, but like it's all being shadow banned. So like it's really hard for like the educators that I know are doing amazing work, and yet they can't get promotions. They're getting banned, they're getting blocked, they're getting, there's currently like a global effort to like try to ban sex on the internet, and like mostly funded by the religious right. I'm writing a post about that, or doing a post about that, but like the organizations that are funding anti-trans bills are the same ones that are funding anti-abortion stuff, are the same ones that are funding anti-porn and anti-sex content. And the anti-sex work content on the internet is the same content that's anti-sex ed. And so it's the same people that are pushing it. And so it's in some ways like support for sex work online is also support for all sexuality education and resourcing online. Our interests are really well aligned. And so I think a lot about like, how do we work together as educators and sex workers to get access to spaces to teach and to give content in like open, expressive ways that people desperately need because they're not getting it anywhere else.
Yes. And if only those people could relax, the people that are fighting could relax a little bit to open up and ask themselves with curiosity, why does this make me so uncomfortable? Why do I have to scream and try and fight and control other people, especially in a country that's founded on liberation, which we obviously, to be very clear, no, it is not. But like the people who are spouting that information are always about liberation, freedom. We know it's not, but the reality is, what the fuck? You're over here being like control. And I'm just like, you don't add up. You don't add up at all.
And according and like research has found that those same people are the ones that are most often closeted homophobic, like closeted gay, closeted trans, closeted secret fetishes. Like they're always the ones that are like the most like shame-based and are the ones that are the most virulently like angry. And it's like, just like deal with their shit and find a way to express it. And like, let's like give you a pathway to your weird fetish. Like, cool, I'll work on that with you. If you're a religious right person listening to this and you're afraid, like DM me. We'll have a session. I'll help you get access to that shit. Because it's like work through it. Don't hurt anybody else in the process of your own bullshit. Or they are deathly afraid of this, like, it's going to change the structure of my family or my life or my meaning or belonging. This came up a lot during the like anti Roe versus Wade stuff that was happening more recently. And I heard this conversation with a conservative person, like a voter, and she was like, my whole church decided this is what we're going to vote for and I can't lose them. She said this on NPR. And I was like, I was like, this is what it is, right? You would lose belonging if you, and belonging is so deeply important. And then there's in-group belonging has been tied now to this like political platforms that are about autonomy, which is another tool of the patriarchy to like coerce and control, to make a political platform about like moral or bodily autonomy issue. It's about control. It's another strategy to control, not actually, they don't give a shit about babies or about my body or about trans kids. Like they don't care.
No.
It's about control and power and coercion.
And it's a great tool to get people enraged and to have a point for them to come around together and do exactly that, where this is what I need to vote for. This is the politician that I need to support because it is this really tender issue that I can build a whole platform around. The people who are running this at the top know exactly what they're doing. There was that documentary, I think it was called Defending Roe. I've mentioned this before on the podcast, that like talked about how the first places to give abortion in America were Catholic churches. And I was so dumbfounded to find that out. I was like, when did this become
like
right? Yes.
But since like the 80s, like it's not that long ago that like Reagan was one of the first who said like we should make the abortion issue the polarity. Like they just it was a political decision. There was abortion rights active from both sides of the aisle previously. So it was deliberate. Like and then it speaks to the sex related stuff. Is like the people who are very anti like sex and access to sex on the internet, access to education on the internet, are also the ones that are not giving any sex ed to their children, and those children are being sexually assaulted. And so I think if anything, we could get motivation in the fact that like you are not talking about it with your kid. They're being sexually assaulted in schools. They're being sexually assaulted by their neighbors, by their teachers, by their whoever, because they're not getting basic help to how their body works. Everyone benefits from information about how to keep yourself safe, how to understand what you want and what you need. Anti-sexual assault work starts with a sex education and starts with like providing everyone with tools to understand that sex is about pleasure, the sex is about connection, the sex is about belonging, and it's not about the ways that like it is being used as coercion and power. Like going back to my first statement in this podcast, like being commodified as a child wasn't that okay, especially in a church that like would say I needed to dress pretty. Like my fundamentalist church was like, you need to look pretty, you need to look good for the Lord. But you can't be too revealing. And it was a very like strict dress code, but then I was like complimented and like touched and like appreciated by all the men in the church for meeting that like very specific, like pure, pretty niche for them, that then they could like please sing for us and dance for us and like perform a little show to prove that you're pleasing to God, which this happens a lot in the Mormon church, like be the most pretty to get the most planets. Please the universe by being this thing, but then don't use your sexuality for your own pleasure or your own good or your own expression.
Right. And I call that trauma.
Totally. It's deep.
Yeah. And it was interesting. It came up in one of my group classes, like that idea of like, what do you do when you have a client who's in it? You have a client who's queer, who's in the Mormon church, who wants to come out but knows it's not safe but wants to stay in the church, and like how do you support that person? I don't know. I think I have a really hard time with that one because I see it as a reenactment patriarchal structures that have taught, and I call it abusive. When you come to a space where your authentic self, your identity that you were born with is sinful and wrong and unacceptable. If this was any other dynamic where it was a relationship and then someone was telling me, oh, my partner says that I am unacceptable for who I am, I would say, that sounds a little abusive. How do you feel about that? You know what I mean? And so it's just so interesting to me that within this society of like religion and all these other pieces, we're so soft about the reality that these are abusive structures for people who are queer, for people who are trans, for anybody that deserves pleasure in their body, especially the Mormon church, which says that you can't masturbate by yourself without that being a sin. Oh my God.
Right.
That is not okay.
Totally. But I think it goes back to the statement we made a few minutes ago, which is like, that is true, it is abusive, it is trauma, but like it is threatening belonging. And so like,
I know.
Having lived in Idaho briefly, like I talked to a lot of Mormon folks and I saw some clients there where it was like, the risk of like losing, like, there are really enmeshed supportive communities.
Totally.
Like,
I know.
potlucks and houses and like well-being, and like they take good care of each other. So, and I experienced that in my cult. The most closest I've ever had in a community was in the cult. It was like, I felt somebody showed up for me all the time. Like there was this belonging. And so the fear of like, I'm not going to belong anywhere else. Like, what if we created more spaces for belonging in our world, more ways that people felt deeply enmeshed, like community and belonging, where they don't need those spaces? That's not the only option they have for that.
Yeah.
Because it's such a, they can't imagine a life without their family, their communities, this thing they do deeply want. And like, if your identities are in conflict with the belonging that you deeply value, it's like you're willing to sacrifice anything. I think about in abusive relationships I've been in, where I will completely disavow all these parts of myself to maintain belonging with a person who's created a dynamic of abuse, who requires that of me. And it speaks to the same pattern, right? That we deeply want. We will put the collective before ourselves when it feels life-threatening, and with trauma, it always feels life-threatening to threaten belonging.
Yep. And then this is why you see a lot of cases. One of my supervisors had worked in Utah and just saw like wild cases of very like immobile children who couldn't even move their bodies from the Mormon church and things. Just when you think about the level of shame and restriction and all of that, we see that come out in various, physical disorders. And so it's just, it's wild to me. I personally can't stay silent about this. This is a huge piece of what I'm passionate about talking about. It sounds like what you're passionate about talking about, because I think as people who have lived it, been in it, see it, my family's still in it. I'm not going to stay silent. And I also just want to take a moment to call out the reality that you getting fired there, that is such an act of activism. And I am so happy to hold this space for you for what you did for that person. And the amount of people who have gone through centuries before, who have been put in jail, who have been banned for all of the things that we look back and think we needed that at that time. That's the work that you're doing. And it might not feel like that when we get those fires, but like you're doing that work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think anyone who knows me in my real life, like knows I'm not very good at being silent about anything.
Good.
So like the minute I like something's uncomfortable or something isn't good, like I'm gonna be really clear about it. But I wasn't always that way, right? Like I was a silent, demure, I was a perfect princess in the cult, perfect straight A's, perfect performance, like missionary, like I was the perfect housewife. I was a perfect everything for this cult, and then the masking at its like highest level. And what it did was tell me that I didn't have value. So being perfect meant that like I didn't get to exist. I didn't get to be myself. I didn't get to have words. I didn't get to have feelings. I didn't get to have art. I didn't get to have play. I didn't get to have pleasure. And it was like, I still feel guilt and shame receiving pleasure. And it's been, almost 20 years. I still feel this, like, I am bad to be receiving. If someone's like just going down on me and I'm like laying splayed open, there's like this, like, I should be doing something. What am I supposed to, am I doing a good job? Like that inner narrative is so intense still. Even when I'm like, even if it's a sub that I'm dominating and I'm like, do this fucking thing for me, but I'm still like, is it okay? Like, it's like so deeply embedded in like my body that I don't get to have, if I'm expressing myself, I don't get to belong, and I'm clearly fucking it up.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I'm working through it. I'm actively fucking doing it every day to practice like receiving. And lately what I've been doing is on dating, when I meet people on dating apps, I just make them fist me and then I have them leave. So I just receive and I don't do anything back. And I'm like, yes, we can play. Yes. I will teach you to fist me. I'm giving you a skill. And then you can go about your way and see you later.
Great. And that's healing. The more times you do that, the more times we can just receive and change that narrative and make new neuronal patterns. But yeah, the reality is that is deep. And I see you in that and the feelings of that and that experience and how deep that can be. And that is a huge part of why I run this podcast. That is a huge part.
Well, maybe we have a whole other episode on culture. That would be kind of fun.
Yeah, totally.
I've been working on some content and things, but yeah, you seem better at getting shit done than I am. So maybe we can.
My goal is to run some purity culture recovery groups.
Yeah, I would definitely like you to that too.
Well, I want to hold a little bit of space as we come towards the end of our conversation in case there was anything lingering. I know we hit so many good things. And I feel so seen in this conversation with where I'm at. I've been having some real strong frustration with the system, especially the training that I'm getting and all of this. Right. And so it felt really nice to be met in this moment when half the time I'm in classes going, what the fuck am I learning? Why is it this?
Totally. Yeah. If I can get maybe my last reflection is just on that. Like, so if you're listening to this and you're a therapist student, you're a new therapist, you're somebody navigating that, like, I think know that you're seen, know that you're not your reactions to the systems are real. And the people that have to teach those programs, the people that have to the people that benefit from those systems perpetuating, are sometimes good people, but just are not able to do the kind of dismantling work that we can start doing as a field. And know that your truth is real, your authentic experience of something being wrong or bad is real, and listen to that and own that and speak that into the spaces. I went through a supervisory training program with the AMFT, and the teacher of the course was racist, kept saying racist things in the AMFT, teacher of the supervisory training. And we called him out on it. I wrote letters to the board. We've addressed it. He still teaches it every session. He's still, and it's there's an example of the systemic oppression in the organizations themselves is really toxic and bad. And the more that we, as the new therapists coming in, are we're not going to do this anymore.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to be a part of your organizations. We don't want to support this. We want to change them. We're going to actually shift the gatekeeping systems. We're going to shift the systems of oppression and the teaching. We're going to shift the content of these systems. We're not going to take courses that are not aligned. We have a lot of power and we have a lot of ability to shift the ways that we are engaging and shift the ways we show up with clients. You alone in your client session, you can be grounded and based in ethics. It's not about you. It's about the client well-being. You're watching your own responses. You're careful what you're sharing, but show up with that fucking person, no matter what kind of system you're in. And when you can't, don't do it. Just take the day off and don't push yourself beyond. Listen to your own internal. You know this from doing psychedelic work. You have to stay aligned with your internal voice and your internal, what the information the universe is giving you, wherever that information is coming from. Because the more you move out of alignment of that, the more harm you do to yourself and other people. And that's when, anytime therapists have done something sketchy to a client, whenever there's sexual assault in therapy, it's because the therapist is not grounded and connected, not getting expression, not in their own relationships, not getting their needs met. It's because therapists aren't doing their fucking work, and therapists need to do better. It is not just sexual transference is a problem. Sexual transference happens every fucking day. Clients will always have arousal and attraction and desire because you're a safe person they're connecting with. How do you talk directly about it? And how do you manage your own shit? So you're getting your needs met, and your client isn't the only person that's reflecting back to you positive regard that week.
Yes. Can I just drop the mic? Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh. It has been a pleasure. I still have one question to ask you that I ask every person on the podcast. And it is, what is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal?
Well, I would argue that normal doesn't exist. So I don't agree with the normative word.
I feel like this has become a secret test for every anarchist on the show. The amount of people who come back and push that. You passed. I'm just kidding.
No, I mean, I think I would say that in the sex therapy realm, that your sexual desires, what you want as a sexual being, can be an anchor to your life. You can choose your relationships, your living space, your whole life can be anchored around what you want sexually, and that being a driving force and a justifiable reason to choose partnerships that are primarily sexually driven, partnerships and lives that are sexually oriented, then that being a valid, important part of expression, just as much as work or familial relationships or other parts, it having just as much weight and power as other parts of identity. And what would it mean? What would need to shift in your life to give it that kind of power and weight and expression and space?
Yes. We're working on it. The spirituality of that too. I'm getting there, right? Holding space for the power of what sex is and what it can be for us in our lives. And I don't even have words to follow that up. I really don't. That was beautiful.
Yeah. Well, thanks for chatting with me. And yeah, if you want to ever have a supervision session too, I'm always available for people. So yeah, if folks are looking for me, Cyborg Dreams with a Z at the end is my social media. You can find all my links on both Instagram and TikTok under Cyborg Dreams. Yeah, I'm taking supervisory clients. I'm teaching some workshops. I'll post some things on there, doing some content. Go to Equitable Care Certification for information on the sex worker therapist certification. And if you have any therapist organizations that you work with, a group practice, any therapist bodies in your school, in your communities, you're working at the APA, and you want us to come and teach for you, we will come and teach the full 12 course series, or we are having recordings we'll have available. We have cohorts. You can send all of your team to a cohort and do the trainings with us. We want to get as many folks as possible trained, and we're also doing some train the trainers if folks want to learn to do the trainings for us. So we can expand to many more therapists. So, thank you.
You're doing such powerful work. If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. And head on over to modernanarchypodcast.com to get resources and learn more about all the things we talked about on today's episode. I want to thank you for tuning in, and I will see you all next week.